Okay, this is English 201, week 3, part 10. There may be an 11 because I feel like I want to hit a stopping point with this, but all right. With the last paragraph on page 5. Now then, said Gregor, well aware that he was the only one to have kept calm. I'll get dressed straight away now, pack up my samples, and set off. Will you please just let me leave? You can see, he said to the chief clerk, that I'm not stubborn, and I like to do my job. Being a commercial traveler is arduous, difficult, but without traveling, I couldn't earn my living. So where are you going? Into the office? Yes? Will you report everything accurately then? It's quite possible for someone to be temporarily unable to work, but that's just the right time to remember what's been achieved in the past and consider that later on, once the difficulty has been removed, he will certainly work with all the more diligence and concentration. Well, you're well aware that I'm seriously in debt to our employer, as well as having to look after my parents and my sister, so that I'm trapped in a difficult situation, but I will work my way out of it again. Please don't make things any harder for me than they are already. Don't take sides against me at the office. I know that nobody likes the travelers. They think we earn an enormous wage, as well as having soft time of it. That's just prejudice, but they have no particular reason to think better of it. But you, sir, you have a better overview than the rest of the staff. In fact, if I can say this in confidence, a better overview than the boss himself. It's very easy for a businessman like him to make mistakes about his employees and judge them more harshly than he should. And you're also well aware that we travelers spend almost the whole year away from the office, so that we can very easily fall victim to gossip and chance and groundless complaints, and it's almost impossible to defend yourself from that sort of thing. We don't usually even hear about them, or if at all, it's when we arrive back home exhausted from a trip, and that's when we feel the harmful effects of what's been going on without even knowing what caused them. Please, don't go away. At least first say something to show that you'll grant that I'm at least partially right. But the chief clerk had turned away as soon as Gregor had started to speak, and with protruding lips only stared back at him over his trembling shoulders and left. He did not keep still for a moment while Gregor was speaking, but moved steadily towards the door without taking his eyes off him. He moved very gradually, as if there had been some secret prohibition on leaving the room. It was only when he reached the entrance hall that he made a sudden movement, drew his foot away from the living room, and rushed forward in panic. In the hall, he stretched his right hand out towards the stairways, as if out there was some supernatural force waiting to save him. Gregor realized it was out of the question to let the chief clerk go away in this mood if his position in the firm was not to be put in extreme danger. That was something his parents did not understand very well. Over the years, they had become convinced that his job would provide for Gregor for his entire life, and besides, they had so much to worry about at present that they had lost thought for the future. Gregor, though, did think about the future. The chief clerk had to be held back, calmed down, convinced, and finally won over. The future of Gregor and his family depended on it. If only his sister were here. She was clever. She was already in tears, while Gregor was still lying peacefully on his back. And if the chief clerk was a lover of women, surely she could persuade him. She would close the front door in the entrance hall and talk to him out of his shocked state. But his sister was not there. Gregor would have to do the job himself. And without considering that he still was not familiar with how well he could move about in his present state, or that his speech might not, or probably would not, be understood, he let go of the door, pushed himself through the opening, tried to reach the chief clerk on the landing, who, ridiculously, was holding onto the banister with both hands. But Gregor fell immediately over, and with a little scream, as he sought something to hold on to, landed on his numerous little legs. Hardly had that happened than, for the first time that day, he began to feel all right with his body. The little legs had the solid ground under them, and to his pleasure they did exactly what he told them. They were even making an effort to carry him where he wanted to go, and he was soon believing that all his sorrows would finally be at an end. He held back the urge to move, but swayed from side to side as he crouched there on the floor. His mother was not far away in front of him, and seemed at first quite engrossed herself. But then she suddenly jumped up with her arms outstretched and her fingers spread, shouting, "Help! For pity's sake, help!" The way she held her head suggested she wanted to see Gregor better, but the unthinking way she was hurrying backwards showed that she did not. She had forgotten that the table was behind her with the breakfast things on it, and when she reached the table, she sat quickly down on it without knowing what she was doing, without even seeming to notice that the coffee pot had been knocked over and a gush of coffee was pouring on the carpet. "Mother, mother," said Gregor gently, looking up at her. He had completely forgotten the chief clerk for the moment, but he could not help himself snapping in the air with his jaws at the sight of the flow of coffee. That set his mother screaming anew, and she fled from the table into the arms of his father as he rushed toward her. Gregor, though, had no time to spare for his parents now. The chief clerk would already reach the stairs. With his chin on the banister, he looked back for the last time Gregor made a run for him. He wanted to be sure of reaching him. The chief clerk must have expected something, as he leapt down several steps at once and disappeared, his shouts resounding all around the staircase. The flight of the chief clerk seemed, unfortunately, to put Gregor's father into a panic as well. Until then, he had been relatively self-controlled, running after the chief clerk himself, or at least not impeding Gregor as he ran after him. Gregor's father seized the chief clerk's stick in his right hand. The chief clerk had left it behind on a chair, along with his hat and overcoat, picked up a large newspaper from the table with his left, and used them to drive Gregor back into his room, stamping his foot after him as he went. Gregor's appeals to his father were of no help. His appeals were simply not understood, however much he humbly turned his head. However much he humbly turned his head, his father merely stamped his foot all the harder. Across the room, despite the chilly weather, Gregor's mother had pulled open a window, leant far out of it, and pressed her hands to her face. A strong draught of air flew in from the street towards the stairway. The curtains flew up, the newspapers on the table fluttered, and some of them were blown to the floor. Nothing would stop Gregor's father as he drove them back, making hissing noises at him like a wild man. Gregor had never had any practice in moving backwards and was only able to go very slowly. If Gregor had only been allowed to turn around, he would have been back in his room straight away, but he was afraid that if he took the time to do that, his father would become impatient, and there was the threat of a lethal blow to his back or head from the stick in his father's hand any moment. Eventually, though, Gregor realized he had no choice as he saw, to his disgust, that he was quite incapable of going backwards in a straight line. So he began, as quickly as possible, and with frequent anxious glances at his father, to turn himself around. He went very slowly, but perhaps his father was able to see his good intentions, as he did nothing to hinder him. In fact, now and then he used the tip of his stick to give directions from a distance as to which way to turn. His father would still stop that. If only his father would stop that unbearable hissing. It was making Gregor quite confused. When he had nearly finished turning around, listening to that hissing, he made a mistake and turned himself back a little way the way he had just come. He was pleased when he finally had his head in front of the doorway, but then he saw that it was too narrow and his body too broad to get through it without further difficulty. In his present mood, it obviously did not occur to his father to open the other of the double doors so Gregor would have enough space to get through. He was merely fixed on the idea that Gregor should get back into his room as quickly as possible. Nor would he ever have allowed Gregor the time to get himself upright as his preparation for getting through the doorway. What he did, making more noise than ever, was to drive Gregor forwards all the harder, as if there had been nothing in the way. It sounded to Gregor as if there were now more than one father behind him. It was not a pleasant experience, and Gregor pushed himself into the doorway without regard for what might happen. One side of his body lifted itself, he lay at an angle in the doorway, and one flank scraped against the white door and was painfully injured, leaving vile brown flecks on it. Soon he was stuck fast and would not have been able to move at all by himself, giving little legs along one side hung quivering in the air, while those on the other side were pressed painfully against the ground. Then his father gave him a hefty shove from behind, which released him from where he was held and sent him flying, and heavily bleeding, deep into his room. The door was slammed and shut with a stick, and then finally all was quiet. That is the end of part 1 of the Metamorphosis. There are 2 more parts, but before we go on to those parts, we're going to discuss part 1. So it's crazy. It's crazy on multiple levels. Now, for starters, Gregor does appear to actually, he's been turned into a bug. There's no explanation. I'll give you a little spoiler. They don't say why he's been turned into a bug, and they never do. In the first sentence, he just wakes up, and suddenly he's a bug. Some kind of cockroach, probably. So it's not a metaphor for him, but it's a metaphor for us. We reading the story are going to have to ask ourselves, why did Kafka decide to write a story about a guy who turns into a giant bug? And I think you'll find it has a metaphorical value. And there's also a lot of irony in his reaction to the situation. Why is there irony? Because Gregor reacts in a way that is extremely different from the way a normal person would react in that situation. So, okay, that's the end of that. And that's the end of week 3, and I will see you guys